Hello friends, Patrick here again. Today we have chapter 4. We're going to be studying, oops, there goes my bookmark, in the book Erich Fromm, Man for Himself, An Inquiry into the Psychology of Ethics. Chapter 3 we finished in the last video was 75-page chapter. This chapter is 120 pages. It takes us all the way from page 122 to page 246. So, over 120 pages long. And to summarize, I have to stop. I'm just going to go up until page 163. So we're going to try and get through about half the chapter in this video. I'm going to make this a short video, but the area that Fromm gets into is he starts to discuss the different types of conscience. And he talks about the authoritarian conscience versus the humanistic conscience. And the main argument I would have against what he does is that in reality, I would argue that he's talking about the same thing, that there is one type of human conscience. He divides them into two separate types of consciousness that people can have. The authoritarian type, which comes from outside the human, comes from external influence, and the humanistic type, which he says comes from within and is just based on the individual human's ability to have a conscience. I would disagree wholeheartedly with that. And I would argue that there is only one type of conscience that is uniform to all humans. Some have more or less conscious than others, of course, but we're essentially talking about the same thing. So that forces me to leave aside what he's trying to convey and really have to backtrack and start from a completely different foundation. But be that as it may, let's try and dig in a little bit and talk about the chapter 4, which is called Problems of Humanistic Ethics. Now, I'm going to share with you the first paragraph of the chapter. And I don't believe that he is able to address this argument throughout the rest of the book. This guy knows the weakness of his own perspective so well that he's able to argue himself out of it and never reconcile that argument. So let me share this with you, okay? This is the first paragraph of chapter 4 of the book Man for Himself by Erich Fromm. It's called The Problems of Humanistic Ethics. I'll try and get through this as quick as I can. It's quite a bit here. So here we go. The most obvious argument against the principle of humanistic ethics, that virtue is the same as the pursuit of man's obligations toward himself, and vice the same as self-mutilation. Do you see what he's saying here? The most obvious argument against the principle of humanistic ethics. So humanistic ethics tells us, which he discussed earlier, that virtue is the same as the pursuit of man's obligation towards himself. So in other words, he says man should be essentially selfish. That's what humanistic ethic teaches. And that vice is to harm yourself. That's what the bad things are. The good is to take care of yourself. The bad is to harm yourself. So he says the most obvious argument against this is that we make egotism or selfishness the norm of human conduct, when actually the aim of ethics should be its defeat. And further, that we overlook man's innate evilness, which can be curbed only by his fear of sanctions and awe of authorities. Or, if man is not innately bad, the argument may run, is he not constantly seeking for pleasure and is not pleasing and is not pleasure itself against, or at least indifferent, to the principles of ethics? Is not conscience the only effective agent in man, causing him to act virtuously? And has not conscience lost its place in humanistic ethics? There seems to be no place for faith either. Yet is not faith a necessary basis for ethical behavior? That's what I would argue towards Fromm. That he is never able to reconcile this argument. That first of all, it's essentially a selfish ideology. Humanistic ethics is at its core elevating selfishness to be the ultimate aim of humanity, to take care of yourself as the be-all, end-all of getting along in the world. So someone who's an adherent of humanistic ethics is a totally selfish person. And he doesn't take into account the conscience. Now, later on in the chapter, he tries to address the conscience, but I believe that he fails because he divides up into two separate types of conscience, and he says this type of conscience is better, and this type of conscience leads to chaos. And then, of course, he never addresses faith either. The benefit of having faith that there is an eternity to face. There is an afterlife to be attained. There is perfect reconciliation of justice in the long run, which includes eternity. There is a perfect law of liberty which rewards every person as they sow, so shall they reap. As you do unto others, so shall it be done unto you. As you judge others, so shall ye be judged. This concept of faith in those type of principles can lead to a self-actualization that I believe is not possible through the selfishness of humanistic ethics. And he never reconciles that in this book. I mean, I'm almost finished the book, but I'm not quite. I've kind of backtracked and finished it and come back, and I've had to reread. So I'm essentially only at page 163. So I got a reserved judgment so far, but maybe he's going to redeem himself miraculously by the end of the book, but I don't think so. So that's the beginning of chapter 4. Has a very powerful awareness of the own weakness of his own presentation, because he is presenting humanistic ethics as the highest form of ethics. He's saying this is the solution to self-actualization, to grab hold of humanistic ethics, to abandon the absolute ethics, or the what he calls the authoritarian ethics, as being detrimental to humanity. He makes space for authoritarian ethics, but you can tell that his main leaning is towards humanistic ethics. And I believe that anybody that would try and absorb this book and his thoughts would be compelled or would be encouraged to follow humanistic ethics and to say, oh, yeah, well, I guess it's okay to be selfish, isn't it? So this is actually a very dangerous book for somebody that does not have any understanding of the necessity of faith and the necessity of the absolute and the necessity of the conscience, which was delivered to us, as we already mentioned earlier, by the Holy Spirit of God, as told to us by Christ. That's where it comes from, right? He said that this is what I'm going to send to the world. I'm going to send a conscience which is embedded in the hearts of humanity, delivered to you from God himself. This is what we learned from this amazing teacher, this Savior of the world, who came and said, hey, guess what? After I'm gone, you're not going to be running around like a bunch of orphans. You're going to have the Spirit of God within you. And if it's not in you, it's going to be convicting your conscience, because it's everywhere. This conscience that was delivered to us from Christ, because of the word that he left us and because of the sacrifice that he did, as testified by the miracles. And he said, even if you don't believe me, he said, the miracles are all there. Anyway, he left this conscience that didn't exist before. There was no awareness of what good or bad was prior to the time of Christ. People just did whatever they thought was the right thing to do. They just were like random animals, essentially, when it came to issues of morality and faith. But since he left the earth, he said, I'm not leaving you here running around like chickens with your heads cut off. I'm leaving you the Spirit of God, which is the conscience of humanity, which is a witness to our spirit of what is right and what is wrong. It tells us internally, whatever our religion, whatever our background, whatever religion we decide to adopt, whether it's our parents' religion or our own religion that we made up, our own type of spirituality that we made up, it doesn't matter. We still have that internal conscience with us. Fromm recognizes that. He said, yes, everybody has a conscience, but he divides it up into two different types of consciousness. He says you either have an authoritarian conscience or you have a humanistic conscience. And he says, oh, it's better to have a humanistic conscience because humanistic conscience allows you to be selfish and only worry about yourself. And if you take care of yourself, then everything else will work out fine for you. Whereas the conscience that Christ taught us, he said, you have to listen to that conscience and respond to it accordingly. And if you make the right response, you're going to be blessed. And if you make the wrong response, you're going to die, right? So he said, you have to listen to that conscience that's within you. There's a law written on your hearts, which doesn't come from human thought or human writing. It comes from the Spirit of God itself. And it tells you within your spirit, this is the right thing you should do. Go this way. And when you don't follow that, this is where chaos comes from. So this is what we're dealing with in chapter 4. I'm going to try and actually, as soon as he finishes the first two paragraphs, he divides the chapter into sections. And the first section is called selfishness, self-love, and self-interest. And he also quotes from a paper that he did in 1939. So this was done, he wrote this right before World War II, or just as World War II was beginning. And it was from a paper that he delivered, and he recreates it here. And the first statement he makes in the paper is that, quote, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And he just gives a quote as Bible. He doesn't mention where in the Bible, but that is actually referenced again another 10 pages later, where he uses it to summarize his conclusion. The idea expressed in the biblical love thy neighbor as thyself implies that respect for one's own integrity and uniqueness, love for and understanding of one's own self cannot be separated from respect for and love and understanding of another individual. So he uses the biblical statement to support his argument that selfishness, self-love, and self-interest are extremely important from the standpoint of humanistic ethics. But let's move on. He introduces the idea of Calvin's theology. So he knew Calvin. He knew his theology. And Calvinism, if you're not familiar, is a very would be the opposite of humanistic ethics. Calvinism is extreme form of self-degradation and self-hatred. And I think Erich Fromm does a great job of bringing that out and explaining that to the reader, that these severe forms of Calvinism, and even also Martin Luther for that matter, expressed a lot of self-denial, self-humiliation, self-hatred, the unworthiness of humanity, how sinful the human being is, that on and on and on and on, that's so popular. Well, that would have been popular with today's MacArthur. I did a review on MacArthur's book called The Gospel of John MacArthur, and John MacArthur would likely be a Calvinist, right? He thinks that all humans are wicked and sinful. All Christians are wicked and sinful. Most Christians are going to hell in spite of their best efforts. It doesn't matter how hard they try. He constantly raises the bar. You're not really saved. You think you're saved, but you're not, because you're this, that, and the other thing. It's very Calvinistic type of thinking. And Erich Fromm understood that very vividly. He goes on to explain Kant. Immanuel Kant emphasized the native propensity for evil in the nature of man, for the suppression of which the moral law, the categorical imperative, is essential, lest man should become a beast and human society end in wild anarchy. So Kant showed a greater respect for the integrity of the individual than did Calvin or Luther. Yeah, exactly, right. So he understood the difference between the theology of Calvin and Luther and the theology of Kant. He also mentions Helvetius, Stirner, Nietzsche. He references so many different sources here that it starts to make my head spin. And I will probably have to go back and reread a lot of these statements. Nietzsche was a psychopathic scumbag, in my opinion. I'm going to give you a quote that Nietzsche believed. He said, "For Nietzsche, it is the essence of a good and healthy aristocracy that is ready to sacrifice countless people for its interests without having a guilty conscience." Imagine. Have you heard anything more satanic than that? He said society should be a foundation and scaffolding by means of which a select class of beings may be able to elevate themselves to their higher duties and in general to a higher existence. Many quotations could be added to document this spirit of contempt and egotism. I'm glad he didn't include them here because it'd probably be damaging to my psyche. Nietzsche, is a very, very bad thinker for anybody that wants to adopt that type of thinking, that the elites are better than everybody else and that they should, rule the underlings. And Nietzsche was impressed by the theory of evolution and its emphasis on the survival of the fittest. And that's the problem with, of course, Darwinism taken out of context, is that a lot of people adopt that exact same thing that Nietzsche adopted. That is, well, since it's survival of the fittest, and because I've made all this money, then I deserve to be an aristocrat. I deserve to be an elite. And I'm better than all these other people because it's survival of the fittest. And because I made all this money or I've reached this position of power, that gives me the right, because of Darwinian evolution, that gives me the right to just stomp on those people that are below me. It's a very, very horrific, evil way of thinking. And Nietzsche endorsed that. Nietzsche believed that these elites were the only ones that were able to express true kindness or nobility or greatness of soul. They elevated themselves above other mere mortals, and it's just sickening. So Nietzsche is not a good man. He didn't leave a good legacy by any means. So that's all I'm going to cover for today. I didn't get through that far. I've only reached up to about page 130. I apologize, but we're going to get through it as quick as we can. We'll try and somehow wrap things up. But thank you again for watching. I love you very much. God bless you. Have yourself a fantastic day. Get some fresh air. We'll talk to you soon, okay? Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Take care.